Today, we land in the book of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah is from that period of the Old Testament, a long time after Abraham and Jacob, a long time after the time of Moses. It's even after the period of the heyday of God's people Israel, when they had existed as a unified kingdom under King David and then under King Solomon. But God's people had been on a trajectory of turning away from him and disregarding his ways, and in the process pulling apart from one another. So that because of their sin against God and their sins against one another, God had withdrawn his protection from them. And they had been conquered, one first and then the other. Israel in the north, conquered by the Assyrians. Judah in the south had been conquered by the Babylonians. And as the way things went in the ancient world, those empires too were conquered by the Persian kingdom. And it's during the period of the Persian kingdom that the book of Nehemiah takes place. So Nehemiah was anxious to find out how the progress was going. Well, when Hanani came back, the report was not good. The temple had been sort of rebuilt, but the walls of Jerusalem were still in terrible, terrible shape. And it says that when Nehemiah heard this news, that he wept for many days, and he went to prayer to his God, and he confessed the sins of his people to God, and he asked that God would pour out his favor upon him and upon his people. And in the process of that praying, God put an idea in Nehemiah's head. So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah. After asking a few more questions, the king granted his request. And so Nehemiah travels over several weeks, maybe even months, from Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire in Asia Minor, to Jerusalem. And when he arrives, the very first thing that he does is by night, all by himself, some on horseback and some on foot, he does a personal inspection of the walls around Jerusalem so that he knows exactly what the situation is. You see, those people who had returned to Jerusalem and who over many years had not been able to get the walls repaired, they put aside whatever it was that divided them. They literally stood shoulder to shoulder, families taking responsibilities for their part of the wall, and they built together. And they took their positions on the wall with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other hand, and at times some of them worked and others turned around and watched and guarded. They literally had each other's backs. And in 52 days, they built the walls of Jerusalem because they saw themselves as being called to something bigger than themselves. And they were convinced that God was with them. Was Nehemiah a great leader? Yeah, he was. But Nehemiah did not build the wall. The people built the wall. Nehemiah simply responded to what God had wired him to do as a leader. The people responded, and by doing so, they became free from fear and oppression and intimidation. But freedom and the measure of independence that they gained came only by dependence upon God and their interdependent striving with one another. Do you sense a theme? We are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. Throughout his letters in the New Testament, Paul stresses that followers of Christ have been set free from sin and death. But here in Ephesians chapter 4, he stresses that our freedom in Christ, is dependent upon our dependency on Christ and our obedience and surrender to Christ. And he also stresses that we all have, the fact that we are free does not mean that we are self-sufficient. We are meant to be an interdependent body of believers. Remember the old African proverb? We've been hearing it a lot for about the last 10 or 12 years. It takes a village to raise a child. Turns out, it takes the church to build the church. Folks, Jesus says, we are the church. You and I. We are the church. So let me ask you a question. Where does Waypoint Church exist? Where does Waypoint Church exist? We have buildings and property here at 8400 Dixie Highway. But Jesus says we're the church. You and I. Not the buildings, but you and I. So the answer to that question really is that Waypoint Church exists wherever Waypoint people go. We need you on the wall. God is calling you to the wall. It takes a church to build the church. It takes a church to build the kingdom. Jesus says we are his church. So here's an idea. Let's be the church. I mean, really. Let's be the church.